I had believed that my connection with Naomi was strong, based on love, trust, and a bond that would endure no matter what. After 2 years of marriage, we spent 7 years together. Before deciding to begin trying for a child, we followed all the rules, established a solid home, developed our careers, and so on. It seemed like the next logical step. Now when I look back, I see how blind I was. Even if the symptoms were obvious, you don't see them when you're in love and have complete faith in the person you're with. Or perhaps you'd prefer not to. The first warning sign appeared quietly. Although Naomi had always been loving, something changed. It was little at first. She kept her phone near her and began texting more. However, I didn't give it any thought. I had no right to monitor my wife's phone. One night, I was really curious and inquired, "Who are you texting?" She hardly raised her head. She said, "Just Lisa," and then locked her screen. "She's going through some stuff." Without question, I nodded. Why would I? Since college, Lisa had been her best friend, and they frequently vented to one another. Naomi began staying out late after that, though. At first, it happened gradually working overtime and making last-minute plans with friends. However, it soon became commonplace. One evening, I said, "You've been out a lot lately," as she reached for her coat. I tried not to come across as accusing, so I spoke in a light tone. She let out a sigh. "Work's been crazy, and Lisa really needs me right now." In an attempt to make her laugh, I quipped, "Every other night?" Rather, she tensed up. Sharp and defensive, she questioned, "You don't trust me?" That confused me. "Of course I do," I blurted out. Before leaving, she yelled, "Then don't question me every time I step out." That ought to have served as my wake-up call. However, I had faith in her. If you don't trust someone, you wouldn't marry them, would you? I chose to ignore the sinking sensation in my stomach. A change in the air. Our distance from one another increased. Discussions became superficial. Our once casual chat felt forced, as if we were playing a role as strangers. Then one evening, Naomi arrived home quite late. When I heard the front door creak open, I was already in bed. Slipping off her shoes as silently as she could, she tiptoed inside. There was a problem. Even before I saw her, I sensed it. "Where were you?" I said in a sleepy voice that was tinged with distrust, or something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Fear?" She paused. I caught it, although it was only a split second. She said, "Work drinks ran late," and put her purse down. She didn't even give me a look. I felt a knot in my stomach. "You could have texted." She sighed in frustration. "I didn't think I needed to check in every second of the day." I gave it up. I wasn't prepared to face what my gut was telling me, not because I believed her. Then everything got out of control. When I tried to bring up the fact that Naomi went out more, she would either ignore me or become upset. One evening, as she reached for her coat, I said, "Naomi, you've been out a lot." She hardly stopped. "Yeah, work's been crazy." "Always with work," I grumbled to myself. She abruptly turned around. "What's that supposed to mean?" I paused. "It just seems like you don't have time for me anymore." She gave an eye roll. "Ethan, I don't need this right now." She vanished once more, in an instant. I told myself that I was simply being insecure and that I was overanalyzing the situation. But in the back of your mind, I was aware. I simply didn't want to acknowledge it. The instant everything collapsed, then everything fell apart one night. Naomi had announced that she would once more be working late. I was sitting on the couch at home by myself, staring at the TV, without actually watching. Something didn't feel right. Have you ever had the hunch or gut sense that something is wrong? That was me. Sitting there with my thoughts racing in the TV's faint illumination. I couldn't get rid of it. I therefore did something I never would have imagined doing. I looked at her phone. Even as I was doing it, I detested myself. I had to know, though. When I unlocked it, my hands trembled. My ears reverberated with the pounding of my heart. Then I noticed it. Text messages. They lasted for weeks. Not Lisa's, not at work, from a man named Derek. They weren't merely cordial, not even close. They discussed getting together, regarding their evenings spent together, about me, how she needed to exercise caution, how she wished me not to know. The world swayed. My stomach turned over. I had numb hands. I scrolled endlessly, reading the messages repeatedly, as if they may cease to exist if I read them too much. Perhaps this would simply be a nightmare when I woke up. However, it was genuine. I had been cheated on by Naomi. For hours, I sat there looking at nothing while holding my phone. My thoughts raced through all the times I had questioned myself and dismissed my intuition. I felt foolish. The front door then opened, and I heard it. She was at home. Something hardened within me. Something cold and definitive took the place of the shock. I didn't hesitate when she entered. With a steady, icy voice, I held up her phone. "What the hell is this, Naomi?" She came to a complete halt. She briefly gave the impression that she might try to refute it. Then her face fell into a crumple. Tears rolled into her eyes. She broke down in tears before I could speak another word. Her voice broke as she gasped out, "I'm sorry. Ethan, I'm so sorry." I waited. I waited for an explanation or an excuse. Something logical. However, all she could say was I didn't mean for it to happen. I tightened my jaw. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I asked in a piercing voice that was a mix of incredulity and rage. "How the hell do you accidentally cheat on your husband, Naomi? Explain that to me." She sobbed even more as she shook her head. "I don't know. I made a mistake." I laughed resentfully. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk." "What did you do?" "That's a choice." She continued to cry. "However, I was finished." I said, "You made your choice, Naomi," in a chilly tone. "Now I'm making mine." My marriage was finished in an instant. I always imagined that I would have a spectacular outburst if I ever found my wife cheating. I might shout. I might toss something. I might immediately throw her out. But when did it really occur? All I felt was emptiness. I saw Naomi sob, her face red and splotchy, her hands shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I made a mistake. Please, Ethan, we can fix this," she repeated repeatedly, as if it were a broken record. "Make this right?" I hardly gave her words any thought as I just stared at her. "How can something like this be fixed?" she said. "We can go to therapy," and took a step forward. Her tone was desperate and frantic. "We can talk to someone. We can." I stepped back. She stopped. "You don't get it," I stated in a remarkably composed tone. "This isn't something you just fix. This isn't a broken plate you glue back together. This is our marriage, and you killed it." Naomi covered her mouth and let out a choking sob, whispering, "I love you, Ethan," she said. I chuckled. A hollow, brief sound. "No, you don't," I acknowledged. "If you did, you wouldn't have done this." She fell all over, and for a moment, I felt something pity. No, resignation. I was finished. "I want a divorce." Naomi let out a gasp as if I had hit her. "No, Ethan, please. It was just a mistake. We can work through this, a mistake," I said, my voice cutting through her tears. "You didn't just wake up one day and accidentally cheat on me. You made a choice. Over and over again. And now you want me to pretend it never happened?" She gave a fierce shake of her head. "No, that's not what I'm saying. I don't want to lose you. You already did." Then there was a deafening hush. The instant she recognized this as real, I saw it in her eyes, that her actions would not be altered by any amount of sobbing, pleading, or apologies. Then, suddenly, something changed within her. The sorrow, the desperation, the remorse, all of it was gone in a moment. Her expression stiffened. She wiped away her tears and yelled, "So that's it? You're just going to throw away everything because of one mistake?" I tightened my jaw. "Naomi," I said, "a mistake is something you do once. You had an affair for weeks, maybe months, and if I hadn't found out, you would have kept going. That's not a mistake, that's a betrayal." Something flared in her eyes. Angry? Disgrace? Perhaps both. She spat. "You're so self-righteous, like you've never made a mistake in your life." I inhaled deeply while trying to maintain my composure. When I said, "This conversation is over," I said, "I'll get a lawyer in the morning." When I left the room, she was still standing there, keeping my pride while losing my wife. The days that followed were a haze of phone conversations, legal paperwork, and quiet. I hardly saw Naomi. While we began the divorce procedure, she packed up her belongings and stayed with her parents. I just wanted her gone, regardless of where she went. Fortunately, we were prenuptial. No drawn-out, untidy legal cases. No asset division, so I kept everything since she cheated. It still stung, though. It wasn't because I desired her return, not because I was missing her. However, this was not the intended course of events. We were preparing for a baby one day. The next, I was actually seeing the breakdown of my marriage. I reflected on all the small things I had overlooked, including the chilly distance, the late evenings, and the awkward chats. I recalled her grin and her love-filled, brilliant eyes on the day I proposed. Was everything a lie? I had no idea. Perhaps I never would. The repercussions. I vanished after the divorce. I modified my phone number, relocated to a different apartment. Stop any communication. Closure was not what I wanted. I refused to accept an apology. All I wanted was to forget about Naomi. That's the problem with heartbreak, though. It doesn't simply disappear. I would still find myself thinking about it months later. Not just about Naomi, but about all the things I lost. The life I believed to be mine. The future that we were meant to create together. I made an effort to move on. I attended treatment. I concentrated on my task. I even resumed my casual, non-serious dating life. Nevertheless, a part of me was still inherently outraged. I'm upset that she was able to get out of this by crying. Angry that despite my best efforts to move on, her dishonesty followed me everywhere and that everyone wanted me to be the bigger person. 3 years later, I was discovered by Naomi's parents. A historical ghost Susan and Tom appeared while I was at the grocery store, taking care of my own affairs. Naomi's parents. It was really unexpected because I hadn't seen or spoken to them since the divorce. I turned, prepared to get away before they saw me. Naturally, though, Susan was the first to notice me. Her voice broke. "Ethan," she called. I turned grudgingly, clenching my jaw. "Susan, Tom." Her eyes were already watery as she took hold of my arm. "It's been so long. How have you been?" This was not a talk I wanted to have. I owed them nothing at all. Susan, however, took a deep, trembling breath before I could dismiss them. She murmured, "Ethan, there's something we need to tell you." I remained silent. "Simply wait." "It's Naomi," she finally answered, her voice shaking. "She was in a car accident. A bad one. She's in the hospital. Serious condition." I was totally blank as I stood there. I had no idea how I was meant to feel. I didn't like that she was hurt. I wasn't going to start feeling sorry for her, though. Susan's voice broke as she gripped my hand. "She's been through so much, Ethan. She's struggling." I sensed that things were going in a negative direction. Then she said it. "Would you visit her?" It nearly made me chuckle. Did she really think I was going to come see Naomi, following all that she did? I gave Susan a direct look and replied, "Naomi isn't my problem anymore." Susan's hand shot to her mouth as she gasped. Tom's expression stiffened. "Ethan, everyone makes mistakes." That was it. I lost it at that very moment. Taking a deep breath, I spoke in a chilly tone. I remarked, "She cheated on me, Tom." That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. And I don't owe her a damn thing. Susan broke down in tears. Tom simply shook his head as if I were the villain. They attempted to guilt-trip me, claiming that life was too short to harbor resentment, that Naomi felt remorse for everything. I didn't give a damn. They were standing in the center of the supermarket when I turned and left. It ought to have ended there. However, my mother called me a few days later. "Ethan," she uttered softly, "you should sit down." I scowled. "Why?" A long pause ensued. At last, she uttered the words that made my blood freeze. "Naomi is dying." I sat there with my knuckles white from holding my phone so tightly. "Naomi is dying." The words were a little surreal. I shook my head and exhaled slowly. "What?" On the other end, Mom sighed. "The accident. It was worse than anyone realized. The doctors don't think she has much time left." I remained silent. I simply gazed at the wall, my mind a jumbled mess. My silence must have been interpreted as hesitation because she continued. "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in, but she's been asking for you." The knot in my stomach twisted sharply. "Why?" Mom hesitated. "She wants to talk to you. She wants to make things right before it's too late." I laughed resentfully. "Make things right?" "Mom, that ship sailed 3 years ago. I don't care what she wants." "Ethan," she spoke firmly now, "I know how much she hurt you, and I'm not saying you have to forgive her. But if you don't at least hear her out, I think you'll regret it." I tightened my jaw. "Regret it? The only thing I'd regret is wasting my time on her again." Quiet. Mom sighed after that. "Just think about it." Without saying another word, I hung up. The burden of history. I tried to act as though I wasn't thinking about it over the next few days, but it persisted despite my best efforts to suppress it. Naomi, dying. I was not depressed. Not at all. I wasn't that guy. The one who wanted to seem to be the forgiving ex-husband and still harbored old feelings in private. However, I wasn't content either. I suppose heavy is the best way to describe it, because Naomi had once played a significant role in my life, whether I liked it or not. I used to love her so much that I couldn't fathom my life without her. And now, she was now resting in a hospital bed, anticipating my arrival as if I were an unresolved chapter in her life. I convinced myself that I owed her nothing. However, it still felt like a huge boulder on my chest. The interference of the family naturally. My family didn't accept it. My sister Emma arrived at my place a few days after Mom called. Not a warning. Don't text. As if she knew I would try to avoid this conversation. She just knocked on my door. She crossed her arms and entered as soon as I opened the door. Her words, "We need to talk." I let out a sigh. "Emma, if this is about Naomi, it is," she cut off. "And you're going to listen." I wiped my face with my hand. "There's nothing to talk about." She laughed. "Bullshit." I glared at her. Emma, with a harsh tone, she interrupted me once more, asking, "Do you really think ignoring this will make it go away?" "Because it won't. Naomi is dying, Ethan. And whether you like it or not, you are a huge part of her life." I balled my fists up. "Yeah, and she threw that away the second she decided to cheat on me." Emma rubbed her temples and moaned. "I'm not saying you need to forgive her. I'm saying you need to be human about this. She's not asking for much. Just to see you one last time. She doesn't deserve that," I yelled. Emma softened her gaze. "Maybe not. But this isn't about her, Ethan. It's about you. About whether you'll be able to live with yourself if you don't go." Hating how easy she was getting under my skin, I gritted my teeth. I mumbled, "You sound just like Mom." Emma grinned a little. "Yeah, well, maybe for once, she's right." Jaw clenched. I turned my head away. Emma whispered, "You don't have to forgive her. You don't even have to say anything. But if you don't go, I think you'll carry that weight forever." She then walked away. The choice I struggled with it for the following few nights. I always saw Naomi when I closed my eyes, not as the cheater, but as the person I once loved, with whom I had arranged a future. And I pondered for the first time in years, what if I hadn't learned? Would she have told me at all? Would she have continued to sneak around behind my back while feigning love for me? Would I discover years later that the woman I had established a life with was dishonest? And would we have had the child we were hoping for? I tried to ignore the ideas by shaking my head. It made no difference. The past was over. But what if I got to meet her one last time and was able to put that chapter behind me? I detested even thinking about the question. However, I ended up sitting in my car outside the hospital at 2 in the morning, gazing at the door as if it had all the answers I had been seeking. Seeing a ghost up close, how long I sat there is a mystery to me. An hour perhaps more. But after a while, I exited and entered. When I inquired about Naomi, the front desk nurse hardly gave me a look. Before I knew it, I was at her door after she gave me her room number. I had a racing heart. Not because I was still attracted to her, not because I was anxious, but because this moment, the one I never anticipated or desired, was truly coming to pass. I inhaled deeply before pushing the door open. With her skin thin and pale, Naomi lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to machinery. She appeared frail, tiny, and she took a breath when we locked eyes. "Ethan." It was hardly more than a murmur in her voice. We both remained silent for a long time. I was at a loss for words. I had 100 various ways of picturing this event. She might ask for forgiveness. Perhaps she would explain herself. Perhaps she would tell me she still loved me while crying. Instead, her eyes were hazy as she stared at me. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. After swallowing, I moved deeper into the space. "Yeah, well, here I am," she smiled, a small, shattered smile. "Yeah, here you are." She briefly closed her eyes and breathed sluggishly. Her eyes were weary when she opened them again. "I don't deserve this," she declared. "I don't deserve for you to be here. But thank you." I said nothing. She reached for a cup of water, her hands shaking, but she was too weak to lift it. I moved forward without thinking and took it, bringing the straw to her mouth. She looked up at me after taking a tiny sip. I ruined everything, didn't I? I didn't respond. She was aware already. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." I wiped a palm across my face and exhaled slowly. I didn't support her. I was there for me. To conclude this chapter at last, with a hushed voice, I confessed, "I no longer hate you, but I'm never going to forget what you did." With tears streaming down her cheeks, Naomi nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." There was silence in the room, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. Aside from the constant beeping of the machines, the hospital room was silent. I had never seen Naomi so little as she lay there. Pale, delicate, not at all like the woman I used to know. She was crying, but it wasn't the dramatic, entreaty-style sobbing she usually reserved for situations in which she needed to win something. It was not the same. Softer, actual. For the first time in her life, perhaps. I was unsure of how to react to that. Her voice was scratchy as she said again, "I didn't expect you to come, but I'm glad you did." I slowly released my breath while leaning against the chair by her bed. "I almost didn't." She smiled weakly. "Yeah," I figured. We were silent for a long time. It wasn't really uncomfortable. Simply put, weighty. As if there were too many unspoken things and too many feelings hanging in the air. Uncertain of my purpose in this place, I glanced down at my hands. "At last," I said, "what do you want from me, Naomi?" Her fingers twitched across the blanket as she swallowed forcefully. Nothing. I swear. I needed to see you. One last time. That didn't sound good to me. Don't talk like that. She gave a little breathy chuckle. Like what? Like, this is the end. She looked at me, telling me that none of us was being deceived. She said the word Ethan, hardly raising her voice above a whisper. It is. My throat constricted as I gazed at her. You don't know that. She smiled once more, but this time her smile was almost serene. I do. That didn't sit well with me. I didn't appreciate her composure. How tolerant. I had harbored a great deal of resentment toward her for years. I had hated what she had done to me and had been bitter toward her for a long time. Nevertheless, while I sit here and watch her disappear, I no longer felt angry. I simply felt worn out. The reality emerges. After a lengthy silence, she said, "Can I tell you something?" I paused. "Yeah." She inhaled nervously. "I never stopped loving you." I clenched my jaw and swallowed hard. You sure as hell had a funny way of showing it. Her eyes gleamed as she nodded. I know. And I won't make excuses. I was selfish. I was reckless. I thought I could have everything, and I lost it all instead. I felt sick to my stomach as I gazed at her. Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Why did you do it?" Startled, she blinked. I said, "I mean it," in a softer tone. "Why?" "We were trying for a baby. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. So why?" Her lower lip quivered as she said, "Because I was scared." Her voice was almost audible. Because the thought of settling down, of being a wife and a mother, of everything being so final, it terrified me. I felt like I was losing myself. Like I was drowning in this life we built, and I didn't know how to tell you. A stab of pain went through my chest. "You never said anything." "I know," she said in a whisper. "Instead, I ran. I sabotaged the best thing I ever had because I was too much of a coward to just talk to you." I averted my gaze to allow her words to fully register. I had been wondering what went wrong for years. Years of wondering if I was sufficient. Perhaps I'd done something to make her leave. It didn't get any better after hearing this, but I knew now, at least. The last farewell hours passed between the minutes. At the same time, we discussed everything and nothing. Old recollections. The happy times before everything went wrong. The life we might have had but chose not to have. It wasn't precisely closure. However, it was something. She reached for my hand at one point. Her fingers were shaking and freezing. "Ethan," she uttered softly, "promise me something." I didn't hold on, but I also didn't draw away. "Depends on what it is." She smiled weakly at me. "Don't let this ruin you. Don't let what I did keep you from loving again." I took a deep breath. "I'm fine." She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left and shook her head. "You deserve happiness. You deserve more than what I gave you." I tightened my jaw. I yearned to hear those words for years. I wanted her to acknowledge that it was she, not me, who had caused the issue. Had she now? I was unsure of how to handle it. I sighed at last. "I don't know if I can promise that, Naomi." Her gaze grew softer. "Just try." I gave one nod. For the first time in years, she smiled naturally. "Thank you for coming," she said in a low voice. I sighed and got to my feet. "Take care, Naomi." Her breathing slowed as she closed her eyes. "Goodbye, Ethan." I didn't respond. I simply turned and left. An alternative form of liberty, I felt. Different by the time I returned to my car. Lighter. I wasn't burdened by our history for the first time in years. I wasn't upset. I wasn't resentful. I had just finished. I spent a lot of time sitting in my car and gazing at the hospital. Finally, without turning around, I started the car and drove off. I drove without a destination the night I left the hospital. It was just me, the open road, and an incessantly chattering mind. I expected to experience relief, regret, melancholy, or closure. I felt empty most of the time, though. I didn't have the same sense of emptiness when I initially learned that she had cheated. Not the type that makes you doubt everything while tearing at your chest. This was not like the others. This was the sort of void that follows a storm. The kind when you realize you survived, but that you've changed while standing in the ruins of something you believed would stay forever. I wasn't damaged. I wasn't lost. However, I was also not entirely. News spreads quickly. Naomi left after 2 days. Her parents didn't tell me about it. My relatives didn't tell me about it. Emma texted me as soon as I woke up. She passed away last night. Thought you'd want to know. I looked at my phone for a while, not really understanding what I was reading. I put it down and got up to prepare coffee without replying. Not because I was indifferent, but because I was at a loss for words. The funeral I was not present at. My mother called a week later, as if to test the waters. She said, "The funeral is this Saturday, with caution." I rubbed my temples and moaned. "Mom, don't," she interrupted. "I'm not saying you have to go. I just think it might help seeing it through, saying goodbye." I shut my eyes. I already said my goodbyes. She remained silent for a while. "Okay," she said at last. "I just wanted you to know." That was the end of the matter. Like any other Saturday, I spent that one in the same manner. Did errands, visited the gym. I ate lunch alone myself in a peaceful cafe. I didn't look at my cell. I didn't consider who was grieving for Naomi, where she was being buried, or if her family was chatting about her awful ex-husband who never even showed up. I was done with that phase of my life, and I didn't allow it to pull me back in. Life continues. Weeks went by, months after, and life went on, slowly. I returned to my job. I spent time with my pals. I resumed dating, just putting myself out there. Nothing serious. Even now, there were nights when the past would creep in, and I would find myself thinking about Naomi while I stared at the ceiling, about how things may have turned out differently. However, those evenings decreased, and when I woke up one day, I discovered that I hadn't given her any thought. I realized then that I was at last free, not only from her, but because of the rage, the suffering, the treachery. I was not the same man who had demanded answers while holding up her phone in our living room. I was no longer the same man who harbored a bitter anger that nearly broke me for years. I was myself, and that was sufficient for the first time in a long time. Concluding remarks. Through all of this, I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't about the other person. Giving them peace isn't the goal. Letting them off the hook is not the goal. In order to avoid continuing to poison oneself with the past, it's important to let go. I will never forgive Naomi for her actions. I did, however, forgive myself for clinging to the hurt for so long, and that's what ultimately freed me.